Good evening, weary traveler, and welcome to another delightfully boring tale from Historian Boring Tales. Tonight, we drift back to the year 1567, when the hills of the Holy Roman Empire rolled with quiet shepherds, the cobblestone villages smelled faintly of fresh bread, and long sermons stretched on so endlessly that one could fall asleep before the priest reached his second amen. But among all the sleepy stories of that drowsy age, one tale stands out, a tale of such legendary slumber that centuries later, a man named Washington Irving would turn it into the fable of Rip Van Winkle. Yes, dear dreamer, this is the longest nap in history, but before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you sincerely enjoy drifting through these tales. And if you'd like, feel free to post your location and what time it is for you in the comments, because nothing is more soothing than knowing you are not alone in your drowsy scroll through history. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket closer, and let's ease into this journey together. The Drowsy Village. In the heart of the Tyrolean Alps, where the mountain peaks are capped with soft pillows of snow and the valleys smell faintly of hay and wood smoke, lay a village so unremarkable, so breathtakingly ordinary, that it has been forgotten by nearly every historian alive, which, for the purpose of a bedtime story, is just perfect. The village, whose name is unimportant and frankly unpronounceable, was home to about 200 souls. 200 people who lived the kind of slow, repetitive life that makes sheep counting seem like an extreme sport. Their homes were squat stone cottages with thatched roofs, always a little smoky inside from the constant fires. Every morning the villagers rose with a crow of roosters, or to be honest, with the crow of many roosters, because the first rooster never did the job. Bread was baked daily in great stone ovens. The smell drifted down cobbled lanes, mixing with the sharp tang of goat cheese and the ever-present aroma of damp wool cloaks. Life was modest and dull and comfortingly the same from one week to the next. Children herded goats. Men cut wood. Women spun wool. And when there was nothing to do, which was often, they argued about nothing at all. Whether a fence was 1 inch too far into a neighbor's field, whether last Sunday's sermon was 1 minute longer than the Sunday before, whether Hans, the woodcutter, was napping too much again. Ah, yes, Hans Böhm, the woodcutter, the napper, the legend to be. Hans was an ordinary man in every sense, medium height, medium build, medium ideas. He had no great ambitions, no grand plans, and certainly no desire to do anything quickly. His greatest gift, if it could be called that, was his ability to nap, anywhere, at any time, under any circumstance. Villagers told stories of Hans falling asleep while standing with his axe still in hand, of Hans nodding off in church, head bobbing like a sleepy goose, of Hans lying in a meadow, supposedly watching the sheep, but in truth providing the sheep with an excellent demonstration of how to doze properly. To Hans, the world was best experienced with eyes half closed, and in this he may have been the wisest man of all. The nap that changed history. One midsummer's afternoon, when the air was thick with the hum of bees and the slow buzz of flies circling lazily over ripening plums, Hans took his dog, a shaggy, faithful mutt named Bruin, into the forest. The forest was cool, shadowy, and filled with the kinds of sounds that soothe a tired mind. Leaves rustling, woodpeckers tapping, streams murmuring as if reciting lullabies. Hans yawned 3 times before he had even crossed the first meadow. Deep in the forest, he stumbled upon a curious sight, a group of tall strangers in old-fashioned clothes playing 9 pins. Now, 9 pins is an ancient game, not unlike bowling. You set up 9 wooden pegs in a diamond and roll a ball to knock them over. The sound of the ball striking the pins echoed like distant thunder through the mountains, unnerving Bruin, but fascinating Hans. The strangers, who spoke little, and when they did, spoke in a dialect Hans could barely follow, offered him a flagon of drink. It was sweet, dark, and heavy, tasting of grapes and oak barrels, with a strange aftertaste of sleepiness. Hans naturally accepted. He was never one to refuse a free drink, especially if it came with the possibility of a nap afterward. He sat beneath a tall oak tree, Bruin curling at his feet. He sipped the drink, blinked slowly, listened to the rhythmic crash of 9 pins in the distance, and before long his head dipped forward, his breathing slowed, and he drifted into the most peaceful nap of his life. But when Hans awoke, the forest was not the same. The oak tree had grown thicker. His dog Bruin was nowhere to be found. The 9-pin players were gone, leaving only faint grooves in the earth where they had once stood. Staggering back to the village, Hans discovered that 2 decades had passed. Children he had known were now grown adults. The baker's apprentice was now the baker himself. The church had a taller bell tower, and not a single villager believed him when he claimed he had only closed his eyes for a short while. Hans Böhm had slept uninterrupted for 20 years, the longest nap in history, and though he himself never thought much of it, after all, Hans went right back to napping whenever he could. The tale spread across Europe, eventually reaching the ears of writers who reshaped it into legend. And centuries later, Washington Irving, sitting in his own quiet study, transformed Hans's tale into the story we now know as Rip Van Winkle. 20 years gone. Hans rubbed his eyes, blinking against the sunlight that seemed just a little too bright, a little too different, as if 2 decades of mornings had been stitched together into one dazzling dawn. His joints ached in a way they hadn't before. His beard, once neatly trimmed by laziness alone, had grown long and wild, and most unsettling of all, Bruin, his faithful hound, was nowhere to be seen. "Bruin!" Hans called softly, his voice rasping with disuse. The forest answered only with the creak of branches and the gentle sigh of wind. Somewhere far off, a cuckoo bird called, but it was no bird Hans recognized. When he finally stumbled back into the village, Hans expected a warm meal, perhaps some scolding from the baker's wife, and then a nap in the hayloft. What he found instead was confusion and whispers. Children who had once tugged at his sleeves now stared at him with wide eyes, whispering to their own children. The smithy, who once had been a boy hammering nails, was now a broad, graying man with a belly full of ale. Even the church bell tower had changed. It stood taller, its stones newer, as if the village itself had grown older while Hans had been dreaming. "Who is this wild man?" one villager murmured. "It's Hans Böhm," another replied, squinting, "though he looks as though he's seen 20 winters without us." "More likely he's seen 20 naps," a third said, and the crowd chuckled uneasily. Hans tried to explain. He told them about the men playing 9 pins, about the strange drink, about how he had simply sat down beneath the oak tree, but his tale was met with shakes of heads and muttered prayers. Some thought him mad, others thought he was cursed. A few whispered that he had been stolen away by mountain spirits only to be dropped back into their world like an old shoe no longer needed. Hans, however, was not concerned. He was mostly tired, and if he had slept 20 years, what was another hour? He found the nearest bench, lay down, and to the great irritation of the villagers promptly dozed off again. Gossip, goats, and good-for-nothing naps. The story of Hans's nap spread quickly. Villagers, who usually had very little to talk about beyond goats and the weather, now had something truly thrilling. A man who had slept through marriages, harvests, plagues, and even a small rebellion in the neighboring valley. At the tavern, mugs clinked as farmers speculated about what Hans had really been doing. "He was bewitched," said one. "He joined the fairies," claimed another. "No, no," said the baker, wiping flour from his hands. "He was just lazy, that's all." The goats, of course, had no opinion, but they seemed vaguely disappointed that Hans was back. During his absence, they had learned to nap quite skillfully on their own, lying in neat rows like furry pillows scattered across the fields. Children followed Hans wherever he went, giggling behind their hands. They tugged at his beard, asked him to tell them what the world was like before, and begged him to demonstrate his famous nap. Hans obliged happily, lying down in the grass while they timed him, though he rarely woke before supper. Even the priest, who usually disapproved of everything, found himself oddly fascinated. 20 years of sleep, he muttered during sermons, and yet he lives. Perhaps the Lord favors rest more than we thought. Still, not everyone was pleased. The miller's wife, for instance, declared that Hans was setting a bad example. If every man slept 20 years, who would grind the grain? Who would chop the wood? Who would mend the fences? But Hans only shrugged. "If every man slept 20 years," he said, "then everyone would wake up together, and no one would notice at all." The villagers didn't know what to do with him. They couldn't quite revere him, for he was no saint. They couldn't quite fear him, for he was too harmless. And they certainly couldn't put him to work, for Hans had mastered the art of looking busy while secretly drifting into slumber. So they gossiped, and they speculated, and they argued about him at length, which, in truth, was exactly the kind of excitement they secretly craved. And through it all, Hans kept napping. What Hans missed. Hans, though not the most curious of men, eventually began to notice the things he had missed during his legendary nap. For one, the children he once knew were now fully grown. Little Greta, who used to tug on his beard while he dozed, was now married, with 2 children of her own, who tugged on his beard in exactly the same way. Life, it seemed, repeated itself, whether one was awake to see it or not. The baker's apprentice, once a nervous boy who could barely knead dough without scattering flour everywhere, was now the village baker. His bread was fluffier, his crusts crisper, but his complaints were exactly the same. There were new fences, though they were still in the wrong places. New roofs, though they still leaked when it rained. New songs sung in the tavern, though the melodies sounded suspiciously like the old ones. Hans realized, with some amusement, that 20 years gone did not mean 20 years changed. The village was older, yes, but it was still a sleepy little place where gossip traveled faster than news, and where the most pressing debate was whether goats preferred the northern pasture or the southern one. Still, There were things Hans had undeniably missed. He had slept through an entire generation's worth of stories. He had missed weddings, funerals, feasts, famines, floods, and fairs. He had missed the rise and fall of fashions in shoes, in hats, in the correct way to stir porridge. But Hans did not mourn these missed moments. Instead, he stretched, yawned, and said to anyone who would listen, "If the stories were worth telling, you can tell them to me now. I will listen until I fall asleep again." And so he became, in a strange way, a keeper of memories. Villagers would sit beside him, recounting the events he had missed. They told him about harvest, good and bad, about new neighbors who had come and gone, about storms that had flattened the wheat and festivals that had lifted spirits. Hans listened, nodded, and sometimes snored. The legends begin. Of course, a tale like Hans's could not remain simple for long. Villagers began to embellish it, adding flourishes that Hans himself never claimed. One version said he had been carried away by mountain spirits, who made him dance until he collapsed in exhaustion, sleeping for 20 years to recover. Another claimed he had been taken to a hidden kingdom beneath the hills, where he feasted with fairy folk until the world above had forgotten him. A particularly dramatic version suggested that Hans had been chosen by time itself, granted a long rest as the world turned without him. Children gasped at this version, imagining time as a great bearded man who tapped Hans gently on the shoulder and said, "Sleep now, friend. I will wake you later." The truth, of course, was far less exciting. Hans himself always shrugged and said, "I was tired. I sat down. I slept. That is all." But truth has never been as entertaining as legend, and soon Hans's story traveled beyond the village. Travelers carried it to the next valley, then to the next town, and before long it spread across the region. Wherever the story went, it grew. In one town, they claimed Hans had slept 50 years instead of 20. In another, they said he had woken with golden hair, a gift from angels. In yet another, they said he never woke at all, but still slept beneath a tree, waiting for the curious to find him. Hans, upon hearing these tales, simply yawned. "If people enjoy telling it, let them," he said, "but please do not ask me to stay awake long enough to correct them." And so the legend of Hans Böhm became less about a man and more about an idea. The idea that one could sleep so soundly, so deeply, that the world itself might change around you, and yet somehow nothing important would be lost. Hans, the village attraction. It was not long before Hans Böhm, the man who had napped through 20 years, became the most peculiar attraction in the valley. Travelers, merchants, and curious wanderers began to stop in the village, not for the bread, not for the goats, not even for the view of the mountains, but to catch a glimpse of Hans himself. They would find him exactly as the villagers described, sitting beneath a tree, leaning against the tavern wall, or stretched out on a bench, always halfway between dream and waking. Children whispered to strangers, "That's him. That's Hans, the man who fell asleep for 20 whole years." Merchants raised their eyebrows. Pilgrims crossed themselves. Scholars scratched notes into little books, as if Hans's yawns might hold some hidden wisdom. And Hans? Hans barely noticed. He would squint at them, smile faintly, and then drift back into slumber before the questions had even begun. Sometimes the travelers tried to provoke him into telling the story. "Hans," they would say, What did you see during your long sleep? Did you dream of golden castles? Did angels whisper in your ear? Hans would shrug. I dreamt of nothing. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the world was different. That is all. The travelers were disappointed, of course, but still they came, and still they repeated the story, adding their own flourishes as they carried it away. Soon, Hans became something of a legend, not just in his own village, but in many others. He was called the Eternal Sleeper, the Dreaming Woodcutter, and my personal favorite, the patron saint of napping. The villagers, who once mocked him, now found themselves oddly proud. They had something no other village had, a man who had slept longer than anyone else in memory. And though they shook their heads at the fuss, they secretly enjoyed the attention. Hans himself remained indifferent. When asked what he thought of his new fame, he only replied, "It is tiring. I think I shall lie down," and lie down he did. Bedtime with Hans. As Hans grew older, he developed a new role in the village. He became, quite unintentionally, a kind of human bedtime story. Children, restless at night, would beg their parents, "Tell us the story of Hans again." And the parents who had told it countless times would sigh and say, "Hans fell asleep beneath the oak tree and woke 20 years later." But this was never enough. Children wanted more. They wanted every detail. What kind of shoes Hans had worn, what the oak tree looked like, what the nine-pin players had said, whether Brun the dog had barked once or twice before curling at Hans's feet. So they invented details of their own. In one version, Hans's beard grew so long during his nap that it circled the tree 3 times and trapped him there. In another, Brun guarded him loyally for 20 years, chasing away wolves, foxes, and the occasional nosy goat. Hans, amused by their questions, began to humor them. When children gathered around him, he would lean back, fold his hands over his belly, and begin in a slow, drowsy voice. "Well, you see, I sat beneath the tree, and the leaves rustled softly, and the 9-pin balls rolled like distant thunder. My dog snored at my feet, and the more I listened, the heavier my eyes became. First I saw the sky, then I saw the inside of my eyelids, and then nothing at all." The children would gasp. "And then you woke up?" Hans would nod. "Yes, 20 years later. The bread was a little different. The chickens were a little older, but otherwise much the same." The children found this both thrilling and, somehow, comforting, because if a man could sleep for 20 years and miss so much yet still find the world waiting for him, perhaps it meant the world was steadier than it seemed. So bedtime in the village changed. Alongside prayers and lullabies, there was now the story of Hans. Parents told it in hushed voices, and children drifted to sleep, imagining themselves beneath the great oak, listening to the sound of 9-pins echoing in the mountains. Hans, unknowingly, had become the lullaby of his people. Hans and the autumn of his life. As the seasons turned, and Hans's hair turned as white as the snow upon the mountain peaks, the weight of his story grew heavier upon his shoulders. He was no longer Hans Böhm the woodcutter, nor even Hans the neighbor. He was Hans the sleeper, a man whose every cough, yawn, and sneeze was regarded as something remarkable. If he sighed while sipping ale at the tavern, whispers rippled through the room. Did you hear it? That is the sigh of a man who has seen the mysteries of time. If he rubbed his knees after chopping firewood, someone would surely murmur, "The great sleeper is restless again." Perhaps another nap is coming. Hans found this amusing. "No, no," he would chuckle. "My knees ache because I am old." That is all. But the villagers preferred their version. They even sought his counsel, as though his nap had blessed him with hidden wisdom. "Hans," they asked, "should we plant rye or barley this spring?" Hans, half thinking of breakfast, would mutter, "Whichever makes better porridge." And the villagers nodded gravely, repeating his words as if they were prophecy. Yet beneath the laughter and sighs, Hans himself sometimes wondered, had he wasted those 20 years? Had he lost them like coins dropped on a dark road? Or had he perhaps preserved them, untouched by sorrow or toil, as if the world had simply kept them safe for him? He thought often of Bruin, his faithful dog who had long since passed, and of friends who had aged without him. And in those moments the oak tree seemed heavier, the silence deeper. But Hans would shake his head and smile faintly. "A nap," he would say, "is never wasted." The villagers took this as a proverb. They repeated it to their children, who repeated it to theirs. Without meaning to, Hans had become not just a man, but a teacher of sleep. And so he lived, content, amused by the fuss, quietly aware that his life had already slipped into legend long before he had left it. The man who became a story. In his twilight years, Hans was less a villager than a living bedtime story. Children would ask, "Is Hans real, or is he just a tale?" And parents would smile, pointing to the old man snoring gently on his bench. "He is both." Travelers came expecting enchantment, perhaps a giant or a wizard glowing with magic. Instead, they found Hans Böhm, scratching his beard, yawning in the sunlight. Some laughed, some were disappointed, yet all of them carried the tale onward, reshaping it as they pleased. And so Hans, even while alive, faded into folklore. He became the eternal sleeper in one town, the dreaming woodcutter in another, and even, in some whispered prayers, the patron saint of naps. The truth mattered less than the comfort the story brought. One autumn night, as leaves rattled softly in the oak above him, Hans drifted into his final slumber. It was quiet, peaceful, and very much in character. The villagers buried him beneath the same oak tree where his 20-year nap had begun. On the stone they carved a simple epitaph. "Here lies Hans Böhm, who slept longer than time itself." But of course Hans did not end there. His tale wandered far, carried on wagons, in tavern songs, in the whispers of storytellers who embroidered new details until the man became myth. In some versions, he still sleeps beneath that oak, waiting to awaken again. In others, he was carried off by mountain spirits. And in still others, he is said to wander through our dreams, a gentle figure who reminds us that the world will still be waiting when we wake. And now, dear listener, as your own eyelids grow heavier, remember Hans Böhm. Remember the oak tree, the rolling echo of 9 pins, the gentle snore of a man who once closed his eyes and awoke to find 20 years had slipped away. If you drift into sleep before the story's end, take comfort. Hans would have been the first to smile and say, "Excellent choice." So rest now, and may your dreams be long, peaceful, and perhaps just a little legendary. Good night.